Hello, my name is Yiyun Li, and I would like to talk about how to utilize geometry, both geometrical setting and geometrical variation, in writing short stories. I will be using the following stories as examples: Three People by William Trevor, The Dead by Bernard Malamud, and Something Amazing by Elizabeth McCracken. I will be talking about these stories from a specific point of view of writing crafts, and I would like to make it clear that in general that is not how I would read a story. I don't think we read literature for crafts, but for characters and stories. These three examples are great stories with great characters, and I certainly don't want to reduce them just to well-crafted stories. Some people hold the view that a story, in contrast to a novel, is an etude. I resist that notion. A short story can be and should be as big, as epic, as symphonic as a novel. And a story is never just a slice or a sliver of life, but as complex, murky, and unresolved as life. To read a great story, in my experience, is to be absorbed into an entire world that is made of many lives. But a story is limited in its space and word count. And in my own reading and writing stories, I have come up with a shorthand to distinguish an okay story or a good story from a great story. In every great story, there are at least 3 stories. Sometimes 3 stories are not enough. Why don't we say 5 stories? In fact, why don't we shoot for 7? It may sound fancy or crazy to work 5 or 7 stories into the space of a single story. But I not only think it's possible, but more importantly, it is necessary if one wants to write a great story. There are many ways to make multiple stories into one story. I'm going to talk about one way, which is to think about geometry in story. Geometrical setting and variation, which are not only to look at events, but patterning. Stories are about human relationships, and the relationship in life and in story, I believe, are made of patterns rather than events. In fact, many of the events are only repetition and variation of the patterns. Let's use William Trevor's story, Three People, as the starting point. As the title indicates, the story happens among 3 people: an elderly father, his grown-up unmarried daughter, and a man who's considered a suitor of the daughter. A triangle is a pattern often seen in stories, as in lives, and I believe that even when things happen between 2 characters, nothing can be strictly limited between those 2. Oftentimes there is a third point, another person, an event, a memory, even an object. So when story happens among 3 characters, we have a variation of situations, with each of the characters serving as a third point for the other 2 characters. In Trevor's story, for instance, if we read scene by scene, we will see that in the exchange between the father and the daughter, they talk about a man only in a most superficial way. We will also see the father and the man's exchange, with the daughter on both their minds, and yet all the important things are left unsaid. Of course, the father, being an elderly man, will become absent one day. Without giving away the story, I would like to read the last paragraph about the man and the woman. Without his presence, this is the father. Without his presence, there would be no reason to play those parts, no reason to lose themselves in deception. The darkness of their secret lit, the love that came for both of them through their pitying each other. All that might fill the empty upstairs room and every corner of the house. But Vera knows that, without her father, they would frighten one another. So that's the last paragraph, the secret shared by the men and women, which cannot be spoken, will no longer be able to stay in the darkness. Trevor's story is about secrets that cannot be said, and the three characters, in one another's absence and presence, only make the secret darker and more menacing. And Trevor, being a master, has one more absence in the story, another daughter who's now dead. Her absence in the story becomes another point to form multiple triangles. The father and the two daughters, the man and the two sisters, one lived and one dead. And of course, the father, the man, and the dead daughter they never spoke about. I don't want to give away anything more about the story, but I would like to say the story, in a contained space, plays with the pattern of triangles, using different ways of triangulation. So we're not reading just one story, but at least 5 stories. What is not spelled out in words is equally, if not more important than what's put into words. In this way, all these untold stories and unspeakable feelings are woven into a haunting and rich tale, all contained in only just 11 pages. Another geometrical approach in short stories is to use mirror images. One example is Bernard Malumet's story, The Dead. The story opens with a description of a street, and soon we realize that the street is becoming a mirror in the story. On one side of the street live an elderly Jewish couple who have spent all their life savings to buy a store as a way to support themselves in old age. On the other side of the street, living in the basement of an apartment building, are an African American couple, the husband working as the caretaker of the building. In the course of the story, the 4 characters never appear in the same scene. Sometimes the husband from one of the couples crosses the street. Sometimes the wife from another couple crosses the street. But most of the times, the story stays with one couple, with the Jewish couple on one side of the street. And yet we know with the street as the mirror, we can see the other couple's marriage reflected. The symmetry of the 2 families, both struggling financially, and both couples trying so hard and so earnestly to maintain some kind of dignity, yet for very human reasons, they suffer more from their hope and dignity than their disappointment. And both couples end up in a bleaker place because of their desire for humanity. In all these aspects, the 2 couples mirror each other. And Malumet efficiently writes the story of 2 families in the space of 1. Of course, there are differences between the 2 families, and the author sometimes zooms in only momentarily in the marriage and the mirror to give a glimpse of the stories not told. For instance, one sentence about the African American couple, a child dead in that marriage, which opens up to a bigger story. In a lesser writer's hand, one of the couples can fill the space for an entire story. It may not be a bad story at all. It may even be a good story. But that good story is only half of story in Malamat's hand. My final example is Elizabeth McCracken's story, Something Amazing, which is from her collection, Thunderstruck. This story, like Malamat's, has two families who are, in one sense, mirror images of each other. Both families have two children, and both families suffer devastating losses. In that sense, it is set up similarly to Malamat's story, in this case, two neighboring families. But McCracken has introduced several variations in this mirroring technique. One is time. In Malamat's story, the two families live in the same time frame, and what happens in the story makes the two couple contemporaries. In McCracken's story, one family's present and another family's past seem to have grown into mirror images of each other. One loss happens in the past, before the opening of the story. One will happen in the future, in the last paragraph of the story. Another variation with McCracken's story is the fluidity of children's movement. Children crossing a door, a threshold, a boundary, even that between life and death. Because there are 4 children, their movements, unsettled, that still mirror. Imagine a reflection leaving the mirror to become an object in the real space, or a real character entering the mirror, a bit like Alice in the Looking Glass. And behind those pair of siblings, we're keenly aware of the 2 mothers from the 2 families, who suffer similar fates, who will become a kind of mirror images for each other. Yet all those horrors in this story are in the making. There are other ways to use geometrical setting. A pattern repeating itself, for instance, in Chekhov's story Darling. A triangle love story can happen when one character among the triangle is dead, as in another William Travers story, The Piano Tuner's Wives. The special mirroring in Malamat's and McCracken's story can be replaced by temporal mirroring. This short video, of course, cannot include many of these wonderful variations, but I hope that when you write your next story, you will think about how to use geometry to include more than one story in the space. Of course, I would like to once again emphasize that there are many ways to write a great story. I don't even know if the 3 authors I talked about in this video would look at their own stories that way. All the same, happy reading and writing.